I am Lubna Hassaniya, and I'm joining you from beautiful California, the Golden State. Whether you are in the US, Canada, or Mexico, Sweden, the UK, or France, Morocco, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Dubai, or Bahrain, thank you for being with us. I am very excited to introduce to you my guest, author and professor, May Rihani, who will be sharing with us her amazing story and her insights into the lives of millions of underprivileged girls and women, and the role she played to help improving them. I would like to first welcome and recognize the dignitaries sitting on the call with us. We have His Excellency Masoud Malouf, former ambassador of Lebanon to Canada, our chargé d'affaires, Wael Hashim, from the Embassy of Lebanon in Washington, D.C. We have Councillor Mirna Khawli, former Consul General of Lebanon in LA. We have also Councillor Ghassan Abdel Khaliq, former Chargé d'Affaires of Lebanon in India. We have Honorary Consul of Lebanon for the Greater Cleveland area, Anthony Asher, Honorary Consul of Lebanon in Tahiti, Joseph Maroon. We are also honored to have with us Honorable Judge Tony Raphael, Dr. Imad Baalbaki, the Vice President for Advancement and Business Development of the American University of Beirut, AUB, Dr. Joe Jabra, former President of the Lebanese American University, LAU. Welcome to all of you. The world is conceived in a womb. Women nurture and shape lives. Doesn't that make them instrumental? Women do not lack fortitude, nor do they lack intelligence. They just need to rise up to their full potential. Although history has always been about his story and his glory, it is never devoid of her spirit. From the famous Cleopatra to Nefertiti and Zenobia, from Anbara Salam Khalidi to May Ziadi and May Rihani. Our guest today, Professor May Rihani, grew up between Beirut and Frankie in the mountains of Lebanon. Born into a family of intellectualism and activism, she was given ample room for imagination. Her father was a master publisher and a book connoisseur. Her mother, a women's activist and a poet of her own right. Within their home in Frankie nestled her uncle's Amin Rihani's museum, putting at her fingertips the works of the founding father of the Arab American literature. In her early 20s, Ms. Rihani was already a published author, a teacher at the college, a political activist, and a columnist in Al-Nahar. Soon after, her career expanded. She embarked on a 35-year-long journey of furthering the cause of girls' education and women's empowerment. Working out of Washington, D.C., she traveled to more than 40 countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, designing and implementing programs to improve the lives of girls and women. She helped raise awareness in the US of the challenges girls and women face today in other parts of the world by teaching courses at the American University in Washington, D.C. and the University of Maryland, and by contributing to the docudrama Girl Rising that aired on CNN in 2013. Among the multiple professional affiliations, Ms. Rihani served as co-chair of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative. She is currently director of the Khalil Gibran Chair for Values and Peace, member at large of the Executive Committee of the Ma'awad Foundation in the USA, member of the board of the International Foundation for Women's Empowerment, and member of the board of directors and director of the Washington Bureau of the World Lebanese Cultural Union. Ms. Rihani is a cancer survivor. She is writer or editor of 8 books in English and 3 volumes of Arabic poetry. She won several awards, among them the award of Joussour Forum des Femmes Marocaines, Femmes Partenaires du Progrès. In Washington, D.C., she received the ADC Women's Empowerment Award. From New York, the Juliet Hollister Temple of Understanding Award. She also received the Khalil Gibran International Award from the University of Maryland and the Saeed Aql Award from Beirut. We have an enriching discussion awaiting us. So let's get started. Professor May Rihani, welcome to Unheard Stories.
Thank you, Lubna. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be on Unheard Stories.
Yes, we are so delighted to have you with us. Thank you. Professor Rihani, you grew up between Beirut and Frankie in the mountains of Lebanon. When you wrote your autobiography, you chose to open your story with a scene set in your home in Frankie, more precisely on the balcony of your home. Now, there is something magical and enchanting about the mountains of Lebanon that makes balconies of homes a treasured experience. What did the balcony of your parents' home in Frankie symbolize to you as a child?
What a lovely question. I love that you're opening this episode of Unheard Stories with this question. Mm-hmm. The balcony of Frankie meant a lot to me. I spent a lot of time on this balcony. It is a place where I learned a lot about beauty. It is a place where you can, in the morning, watch the glorious sunrise from behind Mount Sanin, and Mount Sanin changes colors, changes its robes. A place where you can watch a very poetic sunset in the Mediterranean. It's really a place where I saw the majesty of mountains. I saw the mystery of valleys. Mm-hmm. And I saw the serenity of the sea, of the Mediterranean. I really learned about beauty. Mm-hmm. The balcony was a teacher about beauty. But also, on that balcony, for the first time, I heard Arabic poetry being recited. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that my parents had many friends who were poets, and they would invite them and they would recite poetry on the balcony mm-hmm. in the evening. And I heard them praise the poems, talk about the beauty of the poems. And later on, as a young woman, I did the same. I invited poet friends, and we would read poetry on the balcony, poetry that was not published yet. So the balcony heard it first, before even the publishers. And just basically, the balcony for me was really like having a seat in the theater of creation. A seat where I could see the sun dancing, where I could visit with the moon in the evening, and where I could cherish beauty throughout the day.
What a lovely thing to say. You read my book. I use the balcony as a literary device in my book to symbolize exactly what you just described.
That's right. And I have that in common.
Yeah. And as I see it as a symbol of freedom also, and where your imagination could roam so freely and endlessly, especially as a child, Professor May Rihani. For a child, it becomes quite the experience.
Absolutely. The balcony was my friend as a child.
Yes. Well, throughout your childhood, your home in Frankie was a meeting place, and you just mentioned it, for the biggest names in politics, education, literature, and the arts. In the main living room, if we zero in, your parents had portraits of 5 renowned authors on display. Those of Walt Whitman and Max Eastman hung on the wall, while on the other side of the room, you had those of Amin Rihani, your uncle, Gibran Khalil Gibran, and between the two was that of May Ziadi. Now, you were told as a child that you were named after May Ziadi. Yeah. What image of May Ziadi did you formulate in your mind as a child, and how did she inspire you growing up?
Mm-hmm. Again, Lubna, you are a master of digging deep and going to questions that really bring out a lot of stuff. And as if you took me now, and as if you and I are in the living room in Frankie. And you're right, that living room had 5 magnificent portraits. 4 were men and 1 was a woman. And 2, she was between Gibran and Amir Rihani. And of course, I knew a lot about Amir Rihani, my uncle. And I knew a lot about Gibran growing up. But when I was still young, 7, 8, 9 years old, I did not know as much about May Ziadi. And she was there sitting in the middle, a bit higher than the other 2 portraits. It was like a little triangle. She was in the middle higher, and they were next to her, the 2 big men, the 2 most famous men, at least in my life at that time. And facing them was Walt Whitman. I mean, it was an amazing scene. You're sitting amongst these magnificent writers, poets, thinkers, philosophers. And here is May Rihani. So one day, maybe I was 9, I don't know, I asked my dad, I said, Dad, who is she? And why is she sitting amongst these very important men? And he told me, May Rihani is an intellectual woman. May Rihani is an author and a writer and a poet. May Rihani published in 2 languages, Arabic and French. May Rihani spoke 5 languages, possibly more, but we are sure of 5. May Rihani had an intellectual salon, and many, many, many men and women, intellectual men and women, came to her salon to discuss new ideas, to discuss new trends of literature, of poetry, of philosophy. She was very important. So basically, to me, I don't think we know when we are children how much the ambiance of a home influences us, impacts us. But I think those portraits influenced me a lot. And to have a woman amongst these very important men, indirectly or directly, and I don't know when I was a child if I understood it fully, but I know now that that was a statement about equality of women and men. They are important, she is important.
Definitely.
They are writers, she is a writer. They speak many languages and write in more than one language, she does that too. And so on. So the answer of my father and her presence in our salon, in our living room, forever, as long as I was there, she was there, told me a lot about the equality between men and women from a very young age.
Yes, that's a good answer. And like you mentioned, she held one of the most famous literary salons in the Arab world back in the early 1920s.
Very
which
right.
was an anomaly.
Very
And
absolutely right.
in your mid-20s, you created a literary salon similar to hers. You invited
no doubt I was influenced by her. No doubt I was influenced
exactly.
by her.
I picked on that. And you invited poets, writers, artists to Frankie to discuss literature and poetry. And you had among your regulars big names. Do you care to share some of them with us?
Yes, I would. I don't mind sharing. Said Al was one of them. I mean, he's so big, he's so important. And I was really in my early 20s when I did that, and he accepted to come. Another big name, maybe not as big as him, was Yusuf al-Khal. So yes, some big names used to come.
Yes.
Another one, less known, but extremely important in my view, Joseph Sayer and Joseph Njane. So a lot of important names came to that salon in Frankie. That's right.
Yes. That's really good. And you know, I can only imagine how stimulating the discussions were. Professor Rihani, you attended the AUB as an undergrad. By your sophomore year, you had so much on your plate already. You were a political activist. You were elected to the executive committee of the Lebanese University Students' Union. You published articles in Al-Nahar, and you were also teaching at the college. Now, you said, as a teacher, you made sure to create an atmosphere devoid of fear and intimidation for your students, which were all girls. This atmosphere you created culminated into an incident on Hamra Street. What happened that day, and what impact did it have on you and on them as students?
Thank you for the question, Lubna. Yes, I was teaching while I was a student. I was still a sophomore student when they asked me to teach, and I accepted part-time. And yes, my major idea was to create an ambiance without fear for the students. And they asked me about what are the responsibilities of citizens in Lebanon. And I said we will answer it together. So we tried together in the classroom to answer what is the responsibility of a Lebanese as a citizen of Lebanon. Yes, we have rights. We talked about our rights, but we also talked about our responsibilities. And as a result of that, we then said, we have to practice our responsibilities. We can't just talk about them. We have to put them into action. And one of the things the students decided to do is to clean the streets of Beirut. If we want to put it into action, one of our responsibilities was to keep our streets clean, to take care of the environment, many responsibilities. So we decided one Saturday afternoon to go and clean the streets. And I was at the head of that. We organized it. We spoke to the municipality of Beirut. They sent us all the equipment that we needed to clean the streets. And we did. But it seems the directrice, the director of the Collège Protestant Français, this is a French school, did not like what I did, even though I did it not during the study hours, during the program hours. I did it Saturday afternoon when we didn't have class. She didn't like it, and she decided as a result not to renew my contract. The students decided to go and protest, and the school, the French elite school, it was an elite school, very elitist, sadly so, closed down for many days. They closed it down for the first time. And the media in Lebanon picked up the story, and my students did a sit-in the street to close down the street also. So the major newspapers like Unheard and L'Orient Le Jour had us on the front page. Television stations came and filmed my students and took interviews with me and with the director of the school. It became a big story, not because I wanted it to, but the lesson is, I think what we learned is that our voice should be heard. We need to have responsibilities. We need to act on them. Students and teachers have a right to do things outside class hours and to do them for the country. We can make a difference in a country. The media took our side, all the media, be it newspapers or television or everything. And it became a big issue without us meaning to, but that's what happened.
Yes, that was a real good story. I mean, like you said, you gave them opportunity to learn through a real life experience how to be active members of the society and not to be intimidated.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Absolutely.
A few incidents in 1975 converged for you and set you on a 35-year career journey. An-Nahar newspaper published about your participation in 3 international conferences, among them one in Mexico City, which interestingly marked the first international women's conference ever organized by the UN. You were also offered at the same time to join the Institute for Women's Studies in the Arab world. You said these experiences transformed you. How did they do so?
Absolutely. And they all happened within a period of 12 months. 3 international conferences, and offered to join the Women's Studies Institute at LAU. Dr. Jabra is with us, and he was the president of LAU. It was the first institute for women's studies in the Arab world, not in Lebanon, in the Arab world. So I was offered to join as a staff. And so, yes, those 3 conferences and joining the Institute for Arab Women's Studies changed me, transformed me, because I started understanding some deep issues that we all need to address, number one. I also, such as women's equality, the equality between women and men. Another big issue was internationalism, how important to understand the world, not just our country, and I would go further, not just our region. I always understood myself as a Lebanese, as an Arab, but suddenly it became apparent to me that I need to understand more than Lebanon and the Arab world. I need to understand the world to really be able to see the different perspectives, the different angles, to analyze better, to go deeper in any issue. So yeah, those 3, and I think that because of those 3 conferences, one in Bucharest, Romania, the population conference of the UN, one in Bombay in India, the youth conference of the UN, and one in Mexico City, the Women's International Conference of the UN. And we have many Mexicans with us today. I'm happy to say that. So 3 international conference, women, youth, and population. I was invited to them because of my activism as a student at AUB. AUB provided us with that atmosphere, if you want, free thinking, internationalism, a lot of debating new ideas. And as an activist, and as I was elected to be on the executive committee of the University Students of Lebanon, all the universities, the AUB, LAU, the Lebanese University, the Arab University, and so on and so forth. So I was invited to those conferences, and it created a shift in my thinking and possibly a beginning of a transformation.
Yes, yes, and I could see it from reading your autobiography that you had it in you all along as a calling to help women, deprived women, get a better life. Achieve, Soon after that, you moved to the United States, and your first career stop was at Trans Century, where you served as vice president and director. And that allowed you to become even more global at that point. Could you please share with us your career highlights with Trans Century, your mission, the countries you visited, and how you developed with this experience on a personal level?
Yes. First, I have to admit that I was very lucky to land at Trans Century. And second, I want to say that a colleague of mine, Carolyn Long, is with us today. She was at Trans Century too. We were colleagues at Trans Century. I said I was lucky because the president of Trans Century, Warren Wiggins, was a visionary. And I learned a lot from Warren Wiggins. I think he's a thinker outside the box. He's a visionary and somebody who thinks outside the box. And what I learned at Trans Century through my experiences, you asked me about the countries, it was international work. I was heading the Secretariat for Women in Development. So my focus on women's issues, the equality of women, the rights of women was there, education of women, all of that was there. And from very early on, at Trans Century, I joined at 1977. I worked in the Middle East and Africa. I had two focuses, regional focuses, Africa and the Middle East. The countries, very quickly, some of them in Africa were Liberia, Sierra Leone, Zaire. In that time, we used to call it Zaire. It's the Congo now, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ghana, and so on. In the Middle East or the Arab world, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Yemen. So very early on, I had many countries, the opportunity to work in many countries. And I learned a lot. It was an amazing learning experience about things like the value of the human being, things like the rights. I absolutely believe that every single child on this planet have the total right to go to school. Girls and boys. When I started in 77, the percentages of girls in schools was very, very low in many of the countries that I cited, Yemen, for example, or the Congo, for example, Zaire, or many other, but just those two examples, extremely low. And it was very hard for me to understand why is it that we had such a low percentage. I can talk more about it at one point if you want. But that was my focus, to get more girls in school very early on, to let everybody recognize the right of the girl. It's an equal right, like the right of the boy, the right of women, the right of the mothers, the right of the fathers, the right of women and men. So I learned a lot of that at Trans Century, really. And I learned that we do not accept the status quo. I learned that change is important. I learned that change is possible. I learned that every problem has a solution. I learned that solutions are not far away. We can create them.
True.
I learned that working in a collaborative way is the best way of working. I learned that the respect of different cultures. It's not the culture that's an obstacle for reaching the objectives that we wanted. It's maybe the economy, but not the culture. It's an economic situation. And that was all true.
Yes. What an enlightening journey that was for you. And quite a noble mission to help girls and women.
I said, I
Yeah.
agree, it's a noble mission, but I was lucky to land there. I had started learning about all of that at home, as I said.
Yeah.
My Zedi
Yeah.
was one.
Yeah.
The answer of my father was one,
Yeah.
but also my mother played a huge role in my life. She was
Yes.
an activist in the 40s and in the 50s in Lebanon. I
Mhm.
will never forget bringing the tray of coffee and lemonade to offer to the guests of my mom in
Mhm.
the living room of my house, either in Hamra Street or in Frankie, when I would
Mm.
hear these women activists, my mom and her friends, talking about the right of women to vote. And
Yeah.
I'm very proud to say that Lebanon is the second country that gave Arab women the right to vote. And I'd like to remind everybody, because it's an international audience, that Lebanon gave the right of women to vote before Switzerland, for example, way before, in the early
Mm.
50s, Lebanese women could vote.
Mm.
The Swiss women could not
Mhm.
vote till 1970. So
Mhm.
nearly 20 years before the Lebanese women were voting. Lebanese women were
Mhm.
pioneers in many, many, many ways, and my mother was one of them.
Mhm. 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 How wonderful. Yes, I always, thought of Switzerland being Lebanon of the West.
Yes, that's true. I agree
In
with you.
1991, in 1991, you became senior vice president with Creative Associates International. Now, where you were designing more programs and developing them and trying to implement them with a wide range of projects in girls' education. What countries benefited from your work back then, and what major projects were implemented?
Yes. One of the countries where I had a huge project at Creative was Morocco, one of them. Another one where I had a very large project was Mali, Mali in Africa, and a third one in West Africa, and a third one was Malawi in East Africa. And I have a colleague, Bettina Moll, who worked with me in Malawi. She's sitting there. She's in France now, but she joined us. She worked at the World Bank, and she and I worked together in Malawi. I have another colleague, Natalie Han, who we work together on women in development at Harvard. So many of my colleagues are here today, so I'm very pleased to name a few of them. These are three countries where I had really very large projects funded either by USAID or by the World Bank, or a combination of USAID and the World Bank. Sometimes UNICEF joined in and funded us in those projects. I'll give you a few examples what we were trying to do. For example, in Morocco, we focused a lot on teacher training, and in particular on women teacher training, and in particular in the remote areas, in the very remote areas of Morocco, in the Atlas Mountain. The same in Malawi. We also focused in some countries, not in all of them, because not all of them allowed us to do that work, to look at the curriculum and change the image of women and girls in the curriculum, both in the text, the language, the written text, and in the illustrated images. And to move away from having the women and girls being portrayed as working only within the home, inside the home, with a broom or in the kitchen cooking or whatever it was, to women in their professions, working, for example, in whatever profession they are working in that country, to women in leadership positions, whatever they were in that country, like they portrayed the men. I'll quickly give you an example. We did a very, very quick, while we were doing teacher training for women and men in Malawi, a quick exercise. I told them, please bring your newspaper the next day you come. The teacher training was for a week, 5 days, full 5 days. And we were training master teachers, not the teachers themselves. So they in turn would go and train. And they brought it. And we did a quick exercise. I'm not going to go through it. It's lengthy to go through it. But we discovered that in their daily that they brought, the master teachers, the jobs that were portraying women were three: a housewife, a farmer, and a teacher. The jobs that were portraying men were 35, including the president and the minister and the general and the soldier and the medical doctor and the engineer and the lawyer, and keep going.
The thinker.
The thinker, keep going. 35
Yeah.
versus 3. And that became the point that I was making, that we cannot expect from the girls to go and become a medical doctor or a minister or a president or whatever you want, an engineer, anything you want, or a nurse, if we don't portray that in our textbooks, in our media. If the textbooks are absent, they're absent when it comes to a woman in a leading position. The woman is not going to have an ambition to become, the girl is not going to have an ambition to become what is absent. So some countries, some ministries of education accepted that we work with them over years. Of course, nothing happens over a month or 2 or 3. These programs were, most of them, either 3 years long or 4 years long, or some 5 years long. And this was work to be done over these 3 years or 5 years. Change the curriculum, change the language of the curriculum. I'm talking about primary curriculum and secondary curriculum. All my work was focused on primary and secondary, because that is the foundation of education.
Yeah.
And so we did that kind of work.
What an amazing thing to do, seriously. And to be diligent about it and not give up and keep trying and expanding your horizons with different countries, and go back and implementing them and make sure they're being implemented right.
Lubna, I have to say, when I say we, I mean we, meaning teams of 20 or 25. Yes. They were living in the countries where we were working, and they were a mixture of expats and people from the country. We selected them carefully. We hired them carefully. Yeah. I was the one overseeing, most of the time designing the project, negotiating the project with the Ministry of Education and with the donors, and then overseeing the project. They were the implementers.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. Professor May Rihani, you went on to become Senior Vice President and Director at the Academy for Educational Development, AED, and as a Senior Vice President at Family Health International, FHI 360. What were some of the programs you focused on then, and in what countries also? And could you please tell us about some of the donor organizations you were able to rally around your cause?
Yes, many of the same countries, but we expanded. I expanded a lot at AED. At one point, this is the climax of the portfolio that I had. I had around 20 countries that I was overseeing in Africa, in Asia, and in the Middle East. That was the highest, and it was a very heavy load. Of course, not alone. I was the senior vice president. I had vice presidents under me and directors, and we were running the programs in 20 countries with teams in each country between 10 and 20 or 22. One of the teams was 26. That's the largest I had in country. So the countries were, just to list some of them that I didn't list yet: Pakistan, Afghanistan, South Africa itself, Uganda, I mentioned Mali, Guinea, Senegal. In Africa, I worked in over 24 countries, in the Middle East in 14 countries, in Asia around 10 countries. So many countries and many teams, again, with a focus on education. At that time, I shifted my focus. In the very early 80s, it was primary education. In the 90s, it was primary and secondary. In the 2000s, forgive me, it was totally secondary. I shifted it totally to secondary, and the transition really from primary to secondary and what we do with secondary education, and the linkage between secondary education and employment for girls once they complete secondary. Either the transition to tertiary education, if that's possible for many, when I say if that's possible, for many reasons, economic and other reasons. Sometimes they're great, sometimes the economy of the family, the finances of the family, if not employment. So the transition from secondary to employment or to tertiary, and the linkages with health, what are they learning about health issues, and the linkages with employment. And it was fascinating to work in Pakistan, for example, or to work in Afghanistan, or to work in South Africa, or to work in Uganda, and so on and so forth. We added many to the countries that I already have worked in. Again, when I say working with those countries, meaning starting with the Ministry of Education and convincing the ministry about the priorities that the funders and us, meaning the implementers, agreed upon. And so you start with agreeing with your funder, be it USAID, the World Bank, and others, and I'll mention others. And then you agree with the Ministry of Education, and then you implement. But I personally felt there is more than those three to agree with, meaning the funder, the Ministry of Education in the country, and the implementer. There is civil society. There are the parents. There are the teachers. There are the directors of the schools. Yes. And because I learned all of that, I decided to make it a condition that I will not visit a country except based on some conditions. Yes, of course, I start with the Minister of Education, he or she, but my condition was that I needed to visit urban and rural areas, and I wanted to spend a lot of time in rural areas. I didn't want to see the schools only in the cities because they were much better off. I wanted to see the poorer areas of the countries. And I wanted to meet with directors of schools, with teachers, and with parents. And only if they accepted to organize those meetings for me, I will visit the country and will negotiate the program. Because I was often in the position of negotiating the program that I agreed with the donor, but I had to agree with the ministry so we can implement it. And we had to sign contracts. So the contracts are signed by the donor, the ministry, and the implementer. 3 major signatures to make it a contract. My condition was I don't visit only the ministries. I wanted to hear from the parents and the teachers and the rural areas and the poor areas.
Yes, the grassroots change.
The grassroots, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you happy with the change that you created? Or I'm sure there is tons more to be done, but were you able to see the change that you wanted to see? Let's put it that way.
By the way, this is an evaluation question, kind of, and I have with me Dr. Corey Hyman. I didn't give the titles of everybody else. Nearly everybody I mentioned is a doctor, who was one of the major evaluators who worked on evaluations of many of the projects that I was implementing. I can see him in this photo, and I'm not seeing everybody because I need to change screens. I'm going to just very quickly just look to see who's there. There are many. I'm delighted to see many with us. I'm delighted. Yes, but let me come back and let me answer your question. I just wanted to see my colleagues, who many of them are there. Dr. Corey Hyman can answer it better than I do, maybe, but let me try. Okay. I think a lot of progress has been made. A lot has been made, but a lot needs to continue to be made. Education is a lifelong endeavor, and education systems need to continue changing and improving. They cannot be static. If they're static, there is a problem. No educational system can be static. No educational program, curriculum can be static. They have to continue changing. They have to improve all the time. They have to reflect the age we are in, the issues that we are discussing, the opportunities that exist for young students once they graduate. So continuous change is needed. Yes, there has been progress. And let me quickly give you 2 or 3 major progress that I think happened in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s and 2010 up till 2012, when I was still working on all of these issues. The gap between the girls and boys at the primary is nearly closed. not fully, not in all the countries, not in all the countries of the world. I'm talking primary, 6 years old to 12 years old.
Yeah.
So in many countries where we worked, an example, Malawi, another example, Ghana, another example, Morocco itself, where it wasn't at all the case when I started working, neither in Malawi, nor in Ghana, nor in Morocco, but it's nearly closed. Of course, it is not in Afghanistan. It is not in Pakistan. It is not in Yemen. I'm not going to give you more examples, but in many countries it closed. So that's why we shifted to secondary. The gap in secondary is not closed yet, and I believe it should be. We should continue the work to close that gap. And I'm talking here about Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. I'm not talking outside those three regions because I do not know. And our research, I say our because it's team's research, our evaluations are about these three continents or regions in the world, not outside those regions. So the gap is not yet fully closed. But equally importantly is the quality of education. Education is not just about statistics, even though statistics are extremely important because they don't lie, but it's also about qualitative analysis. It's about the quality of education and the quality of the curriculum and the quality of teacher training. Yes, it improved. But again, I can immediately tell you countries where the curriculum does not reflect equality between boys and girls, not yet. Also, there has been a lot of improvement in terms of education and technology, computers in the classroom, computers for the teachers, and that you would be surprised that maybe the country that made the most improvement in the Arab world is Jordan in terms of computers and technology. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons is at one point, very early in the 2000s, very early, the Minister of Education was a graduate of MIT who totally believed in technology. And the Minister of Technology was also a graduate of university here in the US where technology was a big focus. And they got along. By the way, both of them studied in Lebanon and both of them were graduates of AUB. And they became my friends, both of them. So we were three of us working together. I used to go to Jordan quite often during that time. This is early 2000 till 2005. And we would talk during the day about the system of education and how to link technology and how to, if it's affordable to have computers in the classroom for every student, at what grade do we start that, and on and on and on and on, and who's going to fund that, USAID and the ministry and the World Bank and the ministry and so on and so forth. And in the evening, we'll talk about AUB in Lebanon, even though they were Jordanians, but they loved Lebanon and they loved AUB. And I think AUB was a jumping point for them to go to MIT or other universities to get their their PhDs and their higher degrees.
Yes, well, thank you for sharing that with us. And like you said, there is a lot of work to be done. And if we think about gender inequality, it doesn't only fit in education, but also later on in life when it's times to have a job and get paid. And I was reading some numbers yesterday, and it hit me that even in the US today, the pay gap is greater than 22%. And what is troubling is that it's been at 22% for 3 decades.
Yes, and it didn't move, and it didn't move. And if we enter the employment sector, and we have with us Dr. Charlotte Karam, who's sitting and listening, who was heading CIBL. It's a Center for International Leadership and Employment. I think she will give it to you better. It so happened at AUB again. And they have done a lot of research about on 11 countries in the Middle East about employment and women, and they can tell you about these gaps that you just talked about. And we used to, because we focused, as I said, on the transition of young women or girls, 18 years old, to the university or to the employment field. And we used to study the entry of the employment field. What are the obstacles? And once they enter, if they can be promoted and if there are gaps. And the gaps were huge in many of the countries that I listed, be it in Africa or in the Middle East or in Asia. In Pakistan, there was such a huge gap, and they wouldn't last. They would enter, and then they would drop out after 2-3 years for many reasons. One of them was marriage, but it wasn't only marriage. It was they never got an increase in salary, they never got a promotion, on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, Professor Rihani. How difficult was it for you to reconcile your perspective on life with the incongruent perspectives during your field work?
It was quite difficult at the beginning, not later on. But my first 2 or 3 years, I have to admit, maybe from a privileged family. But we were taught at home that we should never take our privilege for granted, and we're here to serve others. And equality is a golden principle in life, and respect of humanity and human beings is a golden principle in life. And I think we all were brought up like this, my brothers and I. And I really knew about poverty, but I didn't live it. I didn't know it in reality. I'll never forget when I experienced it in Zaire, for example, or in Mali, or in Guinea, or in northern Ghana, and on and on and on. But let me tell you about, was it difficult to reconcile what I believed is basic and what others might have believed is not necessary. Let me quickly try to give you a story from Mali. As I said, I would go to rural areas and I would have meetings with the parents. And every time they organized a meeting for me with the parents, the room that I would come to would have 90% men and 10% women. These are the parents. And all the men would sit in the front and the women would sit in the back. This story is from the late 80s, mid to late 80s, 86, 87, something like that. I was in Mali in a rural area meeting with the parents, and I was talking about the importance of allowing the girls to continue to secondary education, because the highest dropout of girls was immediately after they finished primary education. That was the highest. It was like 70% dropout. So only 30% would cross to secondary education. And this was a huge problem, huge. I mean, 70% who were in primary would drop out. That's it, end of the story. We're at the end of 20th century. They have only a primary school education, if they had, those who had it. I was trying to talk to the parents about, because education, we all know, is about supply and demand. The government is the supply. They build a school, they provide whatever. The parents are the demand, right? If there is no demand, you can do as much supply as you want. It doesn't work, and vice versa. So I was trying in a way to increase the demand by convincing them why it's important to transition the girls to secondary. And I said something like, an educated mother can be a better mother for her children when they're sick. And a man got up, and he was a tall, Malian, handsome, powerful man with a strong voice. And he got up and he told me, "What did you say? You mean to tell me my mother, who is illiterate, is not as good as an educated mother?" And I said calmly, I had to remain calm. And I said, no, your mother is a wonderful mother. When it comes to love, she might be the best mother ever, ever. But when it comes to reading and writing, she was not given that opportunity. She cannot be. She cannot. He said, "What do you mean? She loved me." I said, "Yes, I know. I told you, when it comes to love, she might be the best mother. But when it comes to reading and writing, it's a different story. Let me explain. Allow me to explain why." He said, "Explain." I said, "I have to give you a story. And I'll give it to you very quickly." I said, "Consider 2 mothers from Mali, from your village, We're in a very remote area, very distant from Bamako, the capital. Both have babies. Both babies get very sick. The first day they don't do anything. Second, third, fourth, they notice that the fever is so high. They notice that the child is very sick. They decide to go to the closest basic clinic to them. There are no doctors in the villages, no nurses. So they put the baby on their back. They wrap the baby. They walk. Of course, they're walking with little children, because who is going to take care of the little children who are not at school, the 2 years old and the 4 years old? They walk with them. They're walking a long distance, maybe 4 hours, to reach a clinic. They reach the clinic. There might be a doctor, maybe not. There might be a nurse, whoever, the doctor or the nurse. They examine the two babies, and they tell them what they have to do to those two mothers. One is literate, one is illiterate. Okay? Let's say they start with the literate. They say, your baby has a fever that's so high, it's becoming dangerous. And your baby has diarrhea, he's dehydrated, he or she. And your baby has a very terrible cough, and maybe whatever the symptoms are. So that's what the babies have. And both babies have similar things. They're in the same village. They're in the same weather, very hot weather, very whatever. They tell them the same thing. And let's say it's a nurse, and the nurse or the doctor says, I'm going to give you those 6 pills, and you give a pill to your baby every 2 hours. And I'm going to give you those 12 pills, and you give a pill of those every 4 hours. And I'm going to give you 2 injections. And if there is a midwife in the village, tell her to give the baby 1 every 6 hours. The woman who knows how to read and write takes a little paper and she writes everything. A woman who is illiterate cannot.
Yes.
The doctor gives the pills in an old piece of newspaper. There isn't anything written. There are no labels. There are no pill boxes, nothing in the old newspaper. He tears an old newspaper and he puts the pills and he wraps them and gives them to her. 2 sets plus 2 injections. The 2 women walk home. Another 4 hours home, exhausted, tired, sweating. They come home. The woman who's literate reads her papers and does exactly what the doctor told her. The woman who's illiterate is intimidated. She cries and she knows she might make mistakes. Let me end the story by saying, research all over the world proves to us that literate mothers have a much lower infant mortality than illiterate mothers. And I told them that, and I explained it. He looked at me quietly and he said, if you are right, we should send our girls to school. Even though he said, if you're right, but still, he said, if you're right, he can check it out. I don't mind. Let him go ask a doctor somewhere. We should send our girls to school.
That's a compelling story. Thank you for sharing it. Your missions weren't only physically exhausting, but also emotionally testing. Professor Rihani, during your travels, you found refuge in writing poetry at night in your hotel room. And it was Arabic poetry that you wrote. What did you write about?
That is true, what you said. I would go back to my room after an exhausting day, but exhilarating day, after a very rewarding day, even though physically exhausting. And I would be alone in my room. In those days, I'm talking late 70s. I started at Transcentury in 77. So late 70s, all of the 80s, most of the 90s. We didn't have computers. We didn't have cell phones. I would be myself, with myself in that room, either in a remote area or in the capital city of Conakry, of Guinea, of Mali, whatever. And I'd be myself. I would write poetry. I'd think a lot about my days. I'd think about Lebanon and Africa, Lebanon and Morocco, Lebanon and Yemen, Lebanon and Pakistan, Lebanon and Afghanistan, Lebanon and the US. And I would write poetry about my experiences. Lebanon was present all the time with me, never left me. It lived in my heart. Africa, I fell in love with it, with all of its misery and poverty. The Middle East, I'm an Arab woman, so the Arab world is also part of me. Asia, India has tremendous beauty. Nepal is one of the most beautiful countries, but poverty is amazing. Afghanistan, Pakistan, traditions are very difficult, very no freedoms for women, no rights for women, problematic. So all of these ideas would swirl in my head, would swirl. And the only way to capture anything was to write.
And they ended up words on paper.
Yes.
You wrote these poems in Arabic, and the Arabic language is a beautiful language. It cements our cultural identity. You took pride in the Arabic language at a young age, to the point where when you were in middle school, you asked your parents to switch schools for you because you weren't happy with the way your school was teaching you the Arabic language.
That's true. And I'll tell you exactly why I asked my parents to do that. Because the director of my wonderful elitist, wonderful in certain ways, elitist school, I mean, the quality of education was really high, very, very high, Collège Protestant Français. One day, the director did a big mistake, huge mistake that didn't sit well with me. And she said, I looked at all of your grades, and we were over 1,000 girl students in this marvelous, for Lebanon, this was the elite school for girls. That's what it was, the French school where I was. And she said, you're doing very well in French and English. French was the first language, and they taught us Arabic and English also. And you're doing very well also in Arabic, but I want you to do better in math and science or something like that. And she was talking to us, I mean, in a big assembly room, huge assembly room. And then she said, I want you to know something. We teach you, you're here because your parents sent you here to learn French. French is the language of diplomacy, and you have to learn it and learn it well. They also sent you here because they want you to learn English. English is the language of business. And yes, you need to learn it well. I don't worry about you with Arabic. You will speak it with your maids at home. She said that
didn't sit well with
and
you.
it didn't sit well at all with me. I come from a Rihani family. My uncle is Amin Rihani. My father is a publisher of Arab books. He published in many languages, but Arabic was the major language he published in. At home, we had poets and writers and thinkers and media personalities and philosophers. Charles Malik was considered to be a philosopher, and whatever, who would come and speak about many issues, often most of the time in Arabic, for her to tell us, you learn it you speak it with your maids, and that's how you learn it. I went to my father and my mother, and I nearly cried, and I said, I don't accept that. And my father said, she maybe doesn't know what she's talking about. Your Arabic language is very important. It's a language that carries history and legacy and pride. You have to be proud of it. It's the language your uncle wrote in. He wrote in English also, that's true, but he wrote in Arabic. It's a language that many of our Lebanese and Arab poets wrote in, and they were translated into many languages in the world because of the importance of what they said. So yes, you should be proud of your language.
Yeah. Thank you for being proud of the Arabic language. In one of these poems, you likened yourself to a tiny quill plucked from the neck of a spring bird and tossed around by the winds of fate. Then you described fate as this capricious tempest that is hurling itself at the quill. And you go on saying, maybe if I endure, maybe if I continue the fight, I don't fall apart, there will come a day when I will poke the eye of the tempest. What sensory experience and emotions were you trying to evoke in your reader?
First, let me say you're amazing, Lubna. You're such a reader. I know you read my book about my autobiography, and I know you read my poetry books in Arabic, but you're an amazing reader. That's not a poem that many people cite. They cite other poems, because I think that's a slightly more difficult poem. And what I was trying to write about, I was thinking most probably about all my work in Africa. And here I come from Frankie in Beirut in Lebanon. I'm in the US. I became, my residence became in the US since 1977. And I travel all over Africa to hopefully improve the situation of girls and women and all over the Middle East and again in Asia. And who am I? Who am I? I'm in my mind, I'm nobody, but I was fate decided that my journey is about improving the situation of girls and women in 3 continents. And who am I? I'm a little girl from Frankie. I'm a Lebanese little girl from a village in the mountains in Frankie. But also I was thinking, why is it that these obstacles persist? Why is it that girls and women are not given their full rights? Why is it it's taken us so long? And yes, I wanted to poke really the eye of destiny. And basically what I was trying to say is, God, where are you? Where are you, God? If you exist, you shouldn't allow anymore these inequalities, this poverty in the world. I experienced poverty. I experienced, not myself, but I lived, for example, a full month in Bandundu in Kikwit in Zaire, a full month, 30 days in Kikwit. Kikwit is where Ebola started. I lived there for 30 days. I saw poverty. I saw children dying out of hunger. I carried a child in my arms who the nurse told me, I was asking her about his situation. He was a boy and his hair became very orange, and that's a sign of total hunger. And she told me, I'm sorry to tell you, I don't think we can save him. I said, you have to do everything to save him. She said, we did everything. I said, no, you can't give up. And she said, ask the doctor, we did everything. He will die soon. And yes, I wanted to poke at that time, destiny and God, and say, where are you? Why is this child gonna die? He's 2 years old. What is it? What sin did he do? Nothing. He's an innocent little angel. And he's dying out of hunger. And I felt I'm his mother. He was a Congolese boy from Congo, a Zairian boy from Kikwit, from Bandundu. I really felt I'm his mother. That's the poem.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And you had your own struggles in life. You did not let them bring you down. You were all along determined to poke the eye of the tempest that way too. You had to deal with cancer, and you did pretty much on your own. You wanted to retire 8 years ago, but then the University of Maryland offered you the position of the director of the Gibran Chair for Values and Peace. Can you briefly tell us what some of your accomplishments are during these academic years?
Yeah, I wanted to retire because I wanted to write essays about all of this experience that you asked me about today, and you asked such in-depth questions that I revealed more than I usually maybe reveal. And I wanted time to write, really. But they insisted and I accepted, and I thought maybe I will serve Lebanon and the Arab world through this way, and this time through culture and legacy, and not necessarily through international development and education and employment and women's issues, but through culture and legacy. And I worked on many conferences on Gibran, the carrier of the chair, but also the name of the chair, but also on Al-Rabita al-Qalamiyya, which meant the writers and authors who changed literature in the Arab world. They lived in New York. The 3 major ones are Gibran May Rihani, my uncle, and Khail Naimi. And they lived in New York, and they started Al-Rabita al-Qalamiyya. And it was about new thinking, new way of writing, new outlook, new visions, rebellion in a way on some social norms, rebellion on not seeing that human rights and basic human rights are given to everybody.
Mhm.
They were the philosophers and the thinkers of Lebanon, but also of the Arab world. And I did many conferences about them. And the last one I did, we produced at the university a book titled Reshaping the Landscapes of Arab Thought.
Mhm.
And I'm very proud of that book because it's really about reshaping the landscape of Arab thought.
Yes, yes. And with that, you're bridging gaps between countries, establishing
Yes.
cultures without borders, and which is true to your character, Professor Rihani. You entitled
Thank you.
your autobiography, Cultures Without Borders.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking my questions. Can we open the floor for the audience?
Sure, of course, whatever you say.
Okay. For all those who wish to ask Professor Rihani a question, please leave it in the chat box or raise your hand using the reactions button on the bottom of the screen. And I'm gonna go right ahead to, you have so many notes already. You have one from Umayma Ashur. She's saying, proud to collaborate with May Rihani in the project Women in Progress in partnership with Jusur FFM organization in Morocco and Maryland University, and the chair Gibran Khalil Gibran with Professor May Rihani.
I'm delighted that Dr. Umayma Ashur, who's a professor at Mohammed Sank University in Rabat in Morocco, I'm delighted that she's with us.
Yes.
And yes, we collaborated fully. And she's also the president of Jusur.
Yes.
Jusur is a women's organization in Morocco, a very well-known women's organization, a group of women activists, women leaders who fight for whatever we were talking about, basic human rights, basic women rights. And she, Professor Ashur, Umayma Ashur, teaches at the university, and she teaches about women's rights and teaches about women economic rights and women political rights and women social rights and so on. And we collaborated in a project called Women as Partners in Progress. And it was implemented in Morocco by Jusur, and it was implemented in Jordan by another NGO. I don't know if anybody from that NGO is present today, but maybe. Dr. Umayma Ashur was the head, as I said, of Jusur during that time. We also worked during that project on home-based gender violence. And Jusur did an excellent study on home-based gender violence, in particular during the COVID years. It increased, as we all know, everywhere in the world.
Yes.
Because of what happened to employment and working from home and losing employment and so on and so forth. They did many studies. They did also fascinating studies on the laws in Morocco and how to change the laws to ensure better rights for women, either in employment or in the political system itself.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for answering it. From Cecilia Rihani, she's saying a great pride of women, of a woman who lives the rights and responsibilities from education and with great humility. Congratulations. I'm going to ask Ziad Sayegh to unmute. Please go ahead and unmute. Ask your question, please.
Thank you, Dr. Hassani.
Ahlan.
Thank you, May. Thank you, Professor Rihani, for this in-depth approach. I want to ask maybe a simple question. If the French is no more the language of diplomacy in our days, and the English is more and more the language is of the policy making, what will be the role of the Arabic language? What do you think?
Wow, Ziad, that's a tough and important question, but very, very tough question. Yes, you're right to say English might be the language of policy making. You're right about that. And sorry to say that maybe French is no more the language of diplomacy. Maybe. What is Arabic stands for what? Arabic stands, I think, from my perspective, It's the vehicle that carries a very rich history and a very rich legacy from all the Arab world. We're 21 countries, I believe. The very rich also, but also Arabic was used when the Arab world moved to Spain, Andalusia, and it carries a lot of poetry from Andalusia and a lot of from Spain, meaning. But it's also a language of philosophy. We have philosophers in the Arab world. Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri is one of the great philosophers of the Arab world. Ibn Rushd is an amazing historian, philosopher. So it carries history and philosophy, and it carries literature and poetry, and it carries new ways of thinking. Think about Adonis and his new ways of thinking, a poet and a thinker. Think about Gibran, Rihani, and Naimi and how they changed the Arab world with their literature and their thoughts. Think about multiculturalism. Gibran and Rihani, who wrote in English and Arabic, and who became bridges, really bridges, between the East and the West. Rihani, who happens to be my uncle, spent his life being the bridge between the United States and the Arab world, trying to make the US understand better the Arabs and trying to make the Arabs understand better the US. He wrote in two languages intentionally. It was a very deliberate decision because he wanted to be a bridge between cultures, amongst cultures. So that's what Arabic is. Thank you for your question.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Saleh Suli is saying an absolutely amazing career impacting and promoting the role of women across so many countries, a source of pride for Lebanon. You have
let me quickly say something to Dr. Suli. He also has an amazing career. He was at the World Bank when I was implementing a lot of projects, and the World Bank was one of my biggest with USAID donors. So I owe the World Bank a lot, and I owe USAID a lot, and I owe UNICEF. I should always give UNICEF credit because they also funded a lot of our projects, and they published my books, and they translated my books on development. I wrote them in English. One of my books, UNICEF translated it into Arabic, French, and Farsi because they wanted to distribute it in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But thank you, Dr. Nsuli. Look who's talking. Look who's talking. You had a tremendous career.
I can proudly say he was my guest last year. So You have one from Natalie Hahn from Lincoln, Nebraska. She's saying, congratulations, dear friend May, for you have made a difference and offered hope for thousands of women. My wish is also for your magnificent family who are with us today. I long to see Lebanon again, and I am so saddened with your many struggles. Today, we face a crisis. 3.7 million refugees from Ukraine. The vast majority are women and girls. What is their future and how can we best assist?
Yes, and let me just give a shout out to Dr. Natalie Hahn and Dr. Bettina Moll. I don't know where she is if my screen doesn't show me everybody. They had started at Harvard, a Women in Development group. You're not going to believe when, late 70s. And they asked me to come to Harvard and give a lecture to the group, in which I was at Transcentury at that time, and I did, and we became very close friends since then. So from the late 1970s till now, we've been friends, and we all worked. Yes, thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Bettina. We all worked, here's Bettina, thank you, on women's issues and girls' issues. And we all worked in Africa, the three of us, but I also worked in the Middle East and Asia. And we all, I think, together made a difference together. Now, what's going to happen to the refugees? Yes, you mentioned the refugees, Natalie, from Ukraine, 3-point-something million. And I need to say immediately that Lebanon received the highest percentage of refugees from Syria, Lebanon, again, women and children, more than Turkey. People think that it's Turkey. No, it's Lebanon in terms of percentage per the population compared to the number of the population, not in the absolute numbers. So Lebanon is the recipient of the highest percentage in terms of compared to our population. It is an issue for the refugees themselves and for the receiving countries. Yes. It's a huge issue. It's a huge economic issue, but it's also a huge education issue and health issue and security issue and all kinds of issues. And we need to all pay attention more to those problems that arise suddenly because of wars, the war of Russia on the Ukraine and the war of Syria on Syrians. The regime declared war on the Syrians who were against them. So it created refugees in Lebanon and in Poland. And I need to study it more carefully about what could happen and how we can handle it. And I know UNHCR will do the first steps of basically providing food, which is necessary, but not sufficient. No doubt what UNHCR is doing is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the big donors have to begin think about how to deal with the education of the refugees, the children of the refugees, and the health issues, both in Lebanon and in Poland. The Ukrainian refugees and the other refugees.
There is a drastic economic burden also on the receiving country.
Absolutely.
In every way, shape, or form you look at it. Ms. Rihani, you have one from Judge Tony Raphael. He's saying your accomplishments and work with young women inspire all of us. They remind me of a quote that I once heard, and he's quoting, service is the rent we pay for being. It is the very purpose of life and not something you do in your spare time. And he goes on to say, you embody this principle. Thank you for all that you have done and continue to do. And he's thanking me too. Thank you for being with us, Honorable Judge.
Thank you, Honorable Judge. I'm humbled by what you said, but I totally agree with you. Service is the rent for being and for living. It's the rent we pay. We have to do that service just to be able to sleep well at night and for our soul to feel good.
Yes. You have one from Fatima Sakak to everyone. She's saying, don't have question, but what I can say that I'm proud of you, May, and what you do and what you did.
Fatima is from Morocco and we work together. Fatima is a member of the executive committee of Jusur, and we worked together for the 3 years when we were implementing WPP, Women Partners in Progress. And thank you, Fatima, for being with us.
Yes. Michael Dravis, this is the reference for the book that Professor Rihani mentioned a moment ago, Rihani May edition. Okay, he's leaving some information about your book. There is one from Charlotte Karam. She's saying, such an inspirational journey. Thank you for sharing. You are an inspiring human being.
Let me say something about Charlotte. She's actually inspiring what she's doing also in terms of research studies and implementation work for women in 11 countries in the Arab world is very inspiring. And Michael, yes, the book, Reshaping the Landscape of Arab Thought, I agree with you. It's a very important book, and it talks about basically Gibran and Rihani and what they have done to reshape how we think in the Arab world. They were the pioneers. They were the thinkers, philosophers that helped us move forward and have visions forward. Yes, thank you, Michael.
There is one from Farid Makarim. He's saying, do you think there is a modern day capable author who can document and write about modern Arabia? Again, as Rihani documented and wrote about pre-modern Arabia.
Wow, what a question.
He has another question for you that maybe I will just email it to you. It's a really deep question and it requires thought. Yeah. So what's your answer?
Farid, this is a tough question. I'm sure there is one, an Arab writer who can write about the modern Arab world. but maybe a collection of writers, maybe 3 or 4 together, should write the modern Arab world and should reintroduce or continue introducing what Amir Rihani did when he wrote about Arabia, around the coast of Arabia and the kings of Arabia, and when he introduced in many ways the Arab culture and the Arab history to the West through his English books. Maybe 3 or 4 writers should do it now. He did it in the 1920s and 1930s. Now we are in 2020. Maybe 3 or 4 Arab writers together should take the idea of Farid and write a book about the Arabs of today, because the West doesn't know them well, doesn't. We have stereotype ideas about the Arab world, and that's sad. And we need to rethink how to learn more about the Arabs, how to understand them better and understand their rich culture, their rich history better.
You have one from former Consul General of Lebanon in LA, Honorable Mirna Khawli. She's saying, thanks a lot, Lubna, for those unheard stories, especially today with May Rihani and Women in Power. There's several more from Amal Hawi, Rima Ortakji. I think we're going to have to stop it here, though, because we've stretched your time way beyond what we had planned. Thank you so much, Professor Rihani, for sharing your amazing and inspiring story with all of us today.
Thank you, Lubna, for organizing this program of Unheard Stories, for making us listen to important stories from Lebanese achievers all over the world. And thank you for the audience, and thank you for your very provocative and inquisitive questions. I thank you all. I'm honored to be with you.
The honor is all ours. Thank you. Well, today's event will be uploaded to YouTube and shared with all of you, along with a link to subscribe to get my future invitations. Unheard Stories is a monthly event. It falls on the last Saturday of every month. You don't want to miss next month's conversation, which will be on Saturday, April 30th, with yet another exceptional guest, Dr. George Kikano, Vice President for Health Affairs and Dean of the College of Medicine at the Central Michigan University, CMU. Dr. Kikano will share with us his story in the fields of medicine and healthcare, as well as the change he is spearheading as an executive, educator, physician, and a community innovator. He was recently elected to the Board of Trustees of the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates and the Foundation for Advancement of International Medical Education and Research, helping physicians graduating from international medical schools get their certification to enter graduate medical programs in the United States. Please don't forget to register. You don't want to miss it. To watch past events and know about our future ones, you can follow me on social media. Thank you for bringing us into your home and making us part of your Saturday. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.